She's like a sickness in my brain, a vision standing by the window pane. She ripples through the blinds and leaves me in a daze. It's in the way her body moves me, the way she grabs me and intoxicates, until the signals in my mind forget to operate. Fragile skull, I take my pleasure from my alcohol. She'll never give you any time at all. She just comes and goes, you know, and she's got me.
Hello everybody, welcome back to my channel. Thank you for joining me for another true crime video. Thank you for joining me for another coffee and crime time. Today we are back at it again with unsolved cases that to this day are still cold and I think haven't gotten as much exposure as they need. And today we're talking about the case of 22-year-old Jennifer Lynn Olson Servo, who was found dead in her Abilene, Texas apartment in September of 2002. And 19 years later, her murder has yet to be solved. But before we get started, let's have a word from the sponsor of today's video, Bright Cellars. Bright Cellars is a monthly wine club that matches you with wines you will love. It's so easy to get started with Bright Cellars. All you have to do is take a quick 7-question quiz, a non-snobby wine quiz, so that Bright Cellars can figure out what you like and what you don't like. And based on your answers, they send you a box of 6 bottles of wine directly to the doorstep of your home or office. No more having to go to the liquor store, no more having to stand in front of shelves and shelves and shelves and hundreds of bottles of wine and not know which one to get, because Bright Cellars makes it easy for you. What is even better is after your first box, you can actually rate the wines that you received on brightcellars.com or in their app, and then they can fine-tune your next box to be even more to your liking. I have honestly never gotten a bottle from Bright Cellars that I haven't enjoyed, and that's really why I like Bright Cellars a lot, because I consider myself someone who knows a lot about wine. I consider myself to be someone who has a lot of wine. I do have a lot of wine. Look at this. Wine right there. More wine here. More wine right here. And more wine here. But I also have my safe space, my safety zone of wines that I buy because I know I like them and I don't want to buy a bottle that I don't like, etc., etc. But with Bright Cellars, I have gone out of my comfort zone, tried wines that I normally wouldn't have bought on my own and ended up liking them. So now I have more wines that I like to add to my list of wines, to add to my wine collection. And that's great because I'm expanding my horizons. Even old wine lovers can learn new tricks. Every box of Bright Cellars wine comes with these awesome education cards. They're so pretty. They usually have the wine name and like the design on the front, and then on the back, they have all sorts of information about the wine. It'll tell you the percentage of alcohol. It'll tell you what kind of wine it is, the best temperature to serve it at, the best food pairings. It'll tell you where it's from. And then there's a little thing at the bottom that says rate this wine with stars, and it allows you to rate it and make notes on it. And that will help you remember what you liked about it and what you didn't. So when you go in and rate the wine so that your next box can be modified, you'll remember and you have, better stats to work with. I pulled 2 bottles from my 6-bottle box that I'm really, really interested in trying that I've never tried before. I mean, I've had Rosé and Cabernet before, but I've never had these specific ones, and I liked the names of them. I like the way the bottles look, so I'm pretty sure I'm going to enjoy what's inside as well. This one is a Pedal Press Wine Company Rosé 2019, and I love rosé. I mean, I'm basic. What can I say? I think my entire downstairs wine rack is filled with one type of rosé that I love, so I'm excited to try this one. And then this is a Nihilist Wine Company Cabernet. Cabernet is one of my favorite wines, Pinot Noir, Cabernet, love them. So I'm excited to try this one. And if you also want to find new wines to love, Bright Cellars is offering viewers of this channel 50% off your first 6-bottle box. All you have to do is click the link in the description box and take the quiz to get started. Thank you so much to Bright Cellars for sponsoring this video, and let's dive into the case. Jennifer Servo grew up in Columbia Falls, Montana, right in the heart of the Rocky Mountains. As a child, Jennifer loved to climb trees and sing Yellow Submarine at the top of her lungs. On weekends, she and her sister would get up early to watch cartoons before their parents got out of bed, and from a very young age, Jennifer wanted to be a news reporter like Katie Couric. Her father, Norman Olson, said that Jennifer was an incredibly special person who could and would accomplish anything she aspired to. In elementary school, she used to write and illustrate her own books. She played the flute in the school band, and once she was good at that, she moved on to the baritone saxophone, even though the instrument was bigger than she was. Norman said his daughter was always a free-thinking spirit who would be building snow mice while the other kids were building snowmen, and she was her own person. She didn't follow the crowd. She wasn't afraid to be different. Norman said that it seemed as if as soon as Jennifer would master one thing, she would move on to the next, and everyone who knew her really liked her. And they all remarked on the same thing, her seemingly endless reserves of energy and the way she committed herself to everything she did. In high school, she was a cheerleader, she was very well liked, a good student, and in her junior year when she was 17, she made the decision to join the Army Reserves. Now, I know I'm going to get some comments from people saying I'm wrong. They're going to say, you can't join the Army Reserves unless you're 18, but actually, you can join the Army Reserves if you're under 18 as long as you have parental permission. So it's not like all ages, but if you're 17 and you want to join the reserves, you have to get parental permission, and apparently Jennifer had that because she joined the Army Reserves. And Jennifer had decided to join the Army Reserves because she had an adventurous spirit and she also wanted to make some money to help her pay for college. But while in the reserves, she received numerous commendations, she became a sergeant, and she also started studying journalism. After high school, Jennifer attended the University of Montana in Missoula, just under 3 hours away from her hometown. She would come home on the weekends and school breaks, and her stepfather, Tom Abel, remembered that she was just like any other college student. He said, quote, she would bop in the door and say, "Hey, Mom, hey, Tom," and then would come the laundry, about 6 bags worth, end quote. When she was home from college, Jennifer loved sunbathing at nearby Flathead Lake or eating sausage pizza and sushi. She would sleep late and surf through the national television news channels. Jennifer was a young woman who was known, once again, for her tireless energy, her impish wit, her goofy laugh, and her unshakable work ethic.
I just thought. Okay, go for it. Okay.
In her freshman year at the University of Montana, she would get up at 4 a.m. to go to her job at KPAX-TV. Then she would go to her classes, and she also worked as an anchor on the evening news at Missoula's public radio station. She also got a job working at KECI-TV, where her boss, who also taught classes at the university, remembered Jennifer's incredible energy, saying, quote, she stood out among other students because of the seriousness she had about her work. End quote. In Jennifer's junior year of college, she was accepted into the university's journalism school, and when she graduated with her master's in journalism, she began applying for reporter jobs all over the country because she really wanted to see, what else was out there. Remember, she's got an adventurous spirit. She doesn't want to stay in her own backyard. She wanted to live in different places with different people. And everyone thought she was so brave to leave everything she knew behind and start somewhere that was completely unknown to her. And when she got a job offer at KRBC-TV Channel 9 in Abilene, Texas, she didn't think twice before accepting it, before packing up her whole life and moving across the country. And she ended up moving to Abilene in July of 2002. Jennifer had big dreams. Like I said, she wanted to be Katie Couric, and she told her mother that one day she was going to be living in New York City in a fancy penthouse, and she'd have her family flown in on a private jet, and then a limousine would pick them up from the airport and bring them to her fancy penthouse, and, they would all just have a great time. But obviously, even though Jennifer stood out amongst the other applicants, she was still young, she was still inexperienced, and her starting salary at the station was $7.50 an hour. And she wasn't technically going to be alone in Abilene. Her boyfriend, Ralph Sepulveda, decided to quit his job in Montana and move to Texas with Jennifer, even though they hadn't really been dating that long. Before meeting Ralph, Jennifer had only seriously dated one other person, a man named Dave Warren. Now, Dave and Jennifer had dated for several years, and after they broke up, they'd remained close friends. They spoke often. It wasn't like this bad breakup, but Ralph was very different from Dave. Jennifer had met Ralph while she was in the Army Reserves, but they hadn't started dating until just a few weeks before Jennifer got the job offer. Jennifer's family was not a big fan of her relationship with Ralph because he was 34 years old, 12 years older than Jennifer, and he had big-time bad boy vibes, according to them. He was rough around the edges, he had a lot of visible tattoos, but Ralph was very handsome and very charming, and Jennifer fell for him very hard. She told her friends and her family that she was head over heels in love with her new boyfriend, even though everyone thought it was kind of too soon for them to be moving away and moving in together. And they questioned his eagerness to just drop everything in Montana, uproot his life, and move over 1,000 miles away to live with somebody that he barely knew. Jennifer and Ralph moved into the Hunters Ridge apartment complex on Texas Avenue in Abilene with her cat, Mr. Banks, and she dove right into her new job, trying to make an impression immediately and giving it her all. But within just a few weeks, her relationship with Ralph ended. Jennifer had found out that Ralph had some secrets. He had a fiance in Montana, an engagement that he'd quickly broken off when he had started dating Jennifer, and he also had a child in Montana. Now, it's not clear, but I don't believe that this child was the child of his fiancée from Montana. I think that the child was from a different mother, somebody that he wasn't engaged to, or at least wasn't engaged to when he met Jennifer. But I mean, when he met Jennifer, when they were dating, when they were talking about their future and moving to Texas and starting, a life, he had never told her any of this stuff. He never told her he was engaged when they'd met. He never told her he had a kid. He never told her that he just abandoned his fiance and his child to move to Texas with her. So obviously she was upset because he'd lied to her for as long as he'd known her. So when she discovered his secrets, Jennifer asked Ralph to move out, which he did, but he didn't return to Montana to his ex-fiancée or to be a father to his child. He remained in Abilene, moving to another apartment close to Jennifer's, hoping that there was a chance she would change her mind. According to Jennifer's friends and family, Ralph had a tendency to stop by after the breakup and, kind of beg Jennifer to reconsider and cry and ask her to get back together with him, but she stood her ground and refused. Jennifer had been living in Abilene for roughly 2 months by the night of September 15th. It was a Sunday, and she'd been working the late shift. After she was done, Jennifer and her coworker and friend, Brian Travers, went grocery shopping. Brian was 23, handsome, clean-cut, probably the kind of guy that Jennifer's family wished she'd gotten involved with when she got involved with Ralph, and Brian also worked as the weatherman at KRBC. After her separation from Ralph, Jennifer and Brian had become close friends, but it seemed as if Brian wanted it to be more. Jennifer told her friends that she'd made out with him one night in the weather center, and for her, it had only been a one-time thing, but she sensed that he'd wanted it to be, something else, like an actual relationship. Jennifer genuinely liked Brian. She appreciated him as a friend, and she thought that he was a really great guy, but after her disappointing relationship with Ralph, she really just wanted to focus on her career, and she wasn't ready for anything serious, so they remained friends. On the evening of September 15th, surveillance cameras at a Walmart in Abilene captured both Jennifer and Brian doing some late-night shopping at 10:45 p.m. And according to Brian, after this, they drove to his apartment and she helped him bring his groceries inside. Brian then offered to walk Jennifer to her car, but she said she was fine. They said goodbye, and after she left, he went to bed. After leaving Brian's, Jennifer drove home and placed a call to her ex-boyfriend and current friend, Dave Warren, who was a weatherman in Montana. And remember, this was the guy she dated for a long time before Ralph. They broke up. They remained friends. And Jennifer placed this call at 12:30 a.m., so this is the morning of Monday, September 16th. When questioned later, Dave said there was nothing out of the ordinary about their conversation. Jennifer seemed perfectly normal. They talked for about an hour. They discussed plans to see each other in Dallas, Texas the following December, and then they hung up. Brian Travers would be the last person to see Jennifer Servo alive, and Dave Warren would be the last person to ever talk to her. Jennifer was supposed to have had off from work the next couple of days, but on Tuesday, September 17th, the station was understaffed. So the news director and Jennifer's boss, Toby Dagenhart, called Jennifer at home to see if she could come in, but she didn't answer, so he left a message. He called again the next day on Wednesday, the 18th, and once again he got no answer. And another employee at the station who was friends with Jennifer had told Toby that they'd stopped by Jennifer's apartment, but she didn't answer the door. But they'd also found it odd that the windows of her apartment, the blinds, were closed all the way. And Jennifer never closed her blinds all the way because she had her cat, Mr. Binks, who liked to jump up in the windows or look out the windows, so they were always at least open a little bit. But on this day, they were completely closed. Jennifer's mother had also been trying to get a hold of her daughter for a few days and was worried when she'd gotten no response. She said usually every time she called, if Jennifer couldn't answer right away, she would always call back as soon as she could, and that would never be, days between her calling back. So she was obviously worried as well, and Toby, Jennifer's boss, decided to call her apartment complex and let them know what was going on, requesting that they do a welfare check on her to make sure she was okay. But after he hung up, as he was waiting for the apartment complex to call him back and let him know what they'd found, the television station's police scanner started going off, announcing a possible DOA at Jennifer's address. An employee at the Hunters Ridge apartment complex had gone to do the check on Jennifer and had found a violent crime scene. There was blood everywhere, and Jennifer was dead from blunt force trauma to her head and strangulation. She had also been sexually assaulted. There were several items missing from her apartment, including her cell phone, a Guess brand purse that had a picture of Anna Nicole Smith, who was dressed up like Marilyn Monroe on it, several DVDs, which appear to be 3 seasons of the television show Sex and the City, as well as the movie Saving Private Ryan. Due to these items being missing, police initially thought that someone may have entered the apartment to rob Jennifer, but then they discovered that there was no sign of forced entry. According to Jennifer's family and friends, safety was no joke to her, and she was very serious about making sure that her apartment was all locked up once she got inside. No one who knew Jennifer felt that she would have left her apartment door unlocked, and one of her friends who'd once stayed the night at Jennifer's remembered how carefully Jennifer had gone around checking to make sure that everything was locked up and secure before they went to sleep for the night. This led police to believe that she had been killed by someone she knew, someone she had either invited to be there or who had showed up and who she didn't find to be a threat, so she let them in. Now, the DNA evidence found in the apartment was plentiful, but complicated. It was believed, due to the phone call Jennifer had made to her ex-boyfriend in Montana, that she had been killed after 1:30 in the morning on that Monday morning, because Brian Travers said he tried to call her Monday morning when he woke up and she didn't answer, and her boss and mother were also unable to get a hold of her in the following days. That meant she had been dead in her apartment for several days before being found. But technically, she wasn't alone. Her cat, Mr. Binks, was with her. And the DNA evidence they retrieved from the apartment was commingled with Mr. Binks's cat hair. They were able to pull a few DNA profiles from the apartment besides Jennifer's, and they found the DNA of both Brian Travers, who was Jennifer's friend and the weatherman at the station she worked at, and the DNA profile of Ralph Sepulveda, who was her ex-boyfriend. This caused complications, though, because both Brian and Ralph had been inside Jennifer's apartment before her death more than once. Ralph had lived there for several weeks, and Brian had been a guest multiple times, so the presence of their DNA could technically be explained away and be considered completely innocent. Since Brian was the last person to have seen Jennifer that night, he was brought in for questioning and he was cooperative, but when it became clear that he was being considered a suspect, his parents hired him a lawyer who would be with him during police questioning, and this made Jennifer's mother, Sherry Abel, feel some sort of way. Jennifer's case was covered on Investigation Discovery's Still a Mystery, and it was also covered on, I think, 48 Hours. But in the episode of Still a Mystery, Jennifer's mother, Sherry, says, quote, "Why would they hire an attorney to be there while he was being questioned?" End quote. I personally don't find this to be suspicious. We have talked about this before, and you really should never go into a police interrogation or an interview without a lawyer, especially if you believe that you're suspected of something that you didn't do. And unfortunately for Brian, he didn't have much of an alibi. It was late when Jennifer had dropped him off at his apartment with his groceries, and the only alibi that he could offer was that he had gone to bed in his apartment alone, which obviously could not be verified by anyone since he was alone. Additionally, a week after Jennifer's murder, Brian told the police that the night they'd been together, the night she was killed, Jennifer was worried that someone was following them. Brian claimed that Jennifer had pointed out a car to him and said that she thought this car was making the same turns as they were, that it was following them, and he had kind of laughed it off at the time and told her, it was just her imagination. Now later, when Jennifer spoke to her ex-boyfriend Dave Warren on the phone, he said that she'd made no mention of being followed. So what are we to make of this claim from Brian that Jennifer felt she was being followed the night of her death? In my opinion, it could be one of three things. 1, Jennifer actually believed that they were being followed and mentioned it to Brian, but he told her not to worry, and then he just forgot about it until a week later. When Jennifer got home to her empty apartment, maybe she was still feeling a bit shaken, which is why she picked up the phone and called David Wallace to chat so that she wouldn't feel alone as she got ready for bed. But she didn't mention it to him because Brian had made her feel silly about it and made her feel like it was all her imagination. 2, Brian made up the whole story of Jennifer saying she was being followed because he knew that he was the last person to have seen her. He knew he had a weak alibi, and he knew that his DNA would probably be found in her apartment because he'd been there, and feeling afraid that he would get charged for something that he hadn't done, but he couldn't prove that he hadn't done, he made up a story that no one could disprove to cast reasonable doubt in case it ever went to trial. 3, Brian did do something to Jennifer, so he made up this story to cast doubt on his involvement. These are the only 3 reasons I can come up with for why Brian didn't tell the police this information immediately the first time he was questioned. Now, the other DNA profile found in Jennifer's apartment belonged to her ex-boyfriend, Ralph Sepulveda. Ralph had moved to Abilene with Jennifer. They'd broken up after she found out that he'd lied to her about being engaged and having a child. And she broke up with him, but Ralph had remained in Abilene, hoping that Jennifer would change her mind and take him back, which she had not done. According to friends of Jennifer's, she had told them that although Ralph had been to her apartment to beg for another chance, she hadn't seen him in several weeks before her death. And when he was brought in for questioning, Ralph gave the same timeline. He said he hadn't seen or spoken to Jennifer in 3 weeks. But during his police interview, Ralph was also completely emotionless. He didn't seem upset at all that Jennifer was dead, that she'd been brutally murdered. And this seemed odd to the police and to Jennifer's friends and family because, he had seemed to love her so much. He'd seemed to really be kind of obsessed with her. He was hoping that they would get back together eventually, so you would think that when he found out someone he cared for that deeply was dead, he should have maybe had a stronger reaction, or at least some kind of reaction, but he didn't. Something that did put Ralph on the radar of the police was information that a friend of Jennifer's had. This friend claimed that while Ralph and Jennifer were dating, he was into rough sex, and a few times Ralph had even choked Jennifer during sex, and due to the fact that Jennifer had died because of blunt force trauma and then strangulation, it just kind of seemed like that may have been his MO. And although there was, some circumstantial evidence, you could definitely point to a motive. Ralph was mad because he wanted to get back together with her. She wasn't having it, so he killed her. One of those if I can't have you, no one can kind of things. His DNA was found in her apartment. His reaction afterwards was strange. You've got the coincidence, I guess, that Ralph liked rough sex, which included strangling Jennifer while they were having sex, and then she's found strangled to death. But even though Ralph looked good for it, the police did not have anything to charge him with, since the DNA was really the only solid thing they had to tie him to the scene. But he'd been living with her for several weeks, so his DNA being in the apartment could easily be explained away by his lawyer should they go to trial. However, Ralph refused to take a polygraph test. He also did not go to Jennifer's funeral, and he did not call her family to voice his regret for their loss. And many found all of these things to be suspicious. To be fair, I don't know if I necessarily find any of these things to be suspicious, especially on their own. He knew he was a suspect, so he didn't take a polygraph test. He was most likely aware that Jennifer's family was not a huge fan of his, so he may have been trying to be respectful by not showing up at the funeral, knowing that they didn't like him, especially after they found out that he'd been lying to Jennifer and he had this fiance and a kid in a different state, so he was probably not, trying to put himself in front of them. And not making contact with Jennifer's family, that even makes sense to me because, like I said, he probably knew they didn't like him, and he probably also knew, or at least suspected, that Jennifer's friends and family thought he might have something to do with her death. Not long after Jennifer's murder, it's reported that Ralph abruptly left town, and he was later tracked down by police to a military base in San Antonio and questioned again. But again, there was nothing the police could do besides talk to him, since the evidence they had was circumstantial at best. They certainly didn't have enough to hold him. They certainly didn't have enough to arrest him or charge him with anything. Now, all of that being said, here is why I think Ralph Sepulveda would be the most likely suspect, in my opinion. I would be interested to know if after the breakup, Jennifer had the locks on her apartment changed. Since Ralph had lived with her, he most likely had a key to her apartment. And even if she'd asked for it back, he could have easily made a copy of that key at any time. Maybe Jennifer had felt getting the key back had been sufficient and didn't want to get the locks changed. And I've lived in apartments before. It's very difficult to have the complex, kind of work with you and get the locks changed on your apartment unless you have some sort of restraining order or some sort of threat hanging over you, which she didn't. And I speculate that Jennifer did ask for the key back, but she probably didn't even consider that Ralph had made a copy. It could very well have been that he was obsessed with her. He'd met her in the Army Reserves, he'd become attracted to her, and he wanted to be with her to the point where he broke off his engagement to another woman to have a life with Jennifer. And not even a month after they started dating, he made the decision to quit his job in Montana and move with Jennifer to Texas, leaving behind, pretty much everyone he knew, including a child. And then after she found out his secrets, she broke it off, even though it was clearly not something he wanted. Like, he didn't want them to break up. I would also be interested to know how Jennifer had found out about his fiance and his child in Montana. If he volunteered the information, it would be a little different, a little less suspicious. But what I suspect happened, and this is once again just my speculation, after they moved in together in Texas, Ralph may have either gotten a call from his fiancée or the mother of his child, or maybe he even received a letter for child support, and Jennifer had accidentally opened it, not knowing it was addressed to him. Because, they'd never lived together before, right? When she was in Montana, she was going to school, she stayed on campus, or she stayed, at her parents' house on break, but they had never been living together to the point where she would see his mail coming in. So he most likely had his mail forwarded to his new address, Jennifer's address. The mail's coming in, she accidentally opens it, she reads what's going on, and she then confronts him. Well, faced with the evidence in front of him, he had to come clean. After she broke up with him, Ralph stayed in Abilene, but why? He hadn't been there long. He didn't have ties to the community. He didn't have friends or a life there. Why would he stay there other than hoping Jennifer would come to her senses and get back together with him? Why didn't he go back to Montana and pick up where he left off with his fiancée, or just return to a place that he knew and people he knew? It seems very likely that he was hanging on to the hope that she would take him back, and as the weeks passed and he realized that it wasn't going to happen, Ralph got more and more angry. Maybe he was even following her. He saw her with Brian. He saw her going shopping, hanging out. Maybe he even heard that they'd shared a kiss in the weather studio, and he got jealous. So he followed her back to her apartment after she had dropped Brian off, which was the car she saw making the same turns as she was. And he waited until he saw the lights go off, signaling that she was going to bed. He then entered the apartment using the key he either still had or a copy of the key he had made. He knocked her over the head, assaulted her, and then strangled her to death. Allegedly. Just my speculation. Don't come for me. I would also be interested to know what Ralph's alibi for the night was. Now, there's no official statement or report from the police stating what Ralph's alibi was, but many sources online claim that he told the police he was at his apartment that night alone and he went to bed, just like Brian Travers, and this cannot be verified, just like Brian Travers. However, the lead investigator on Jennifer's case, Jeff Bell, when referring to Ralph Sepulveda, Jeff Bell said, quote, "All the times that we interviewed him, he never really said anything that made us think this wasn't our guy," end quote. Now, there is an interesting twist to all of this. It seemed like there weren't a lot of murders happening in Abilene, and the only other murder that had happened that year had been the past June, 3 months before Jennifer's death, the month before she'd even arrived in Abilene. But what is really crazy is this murder happened in the very same apartment complex, Hunter's Ridge, just on the other side of the wall shared by Jennifer's apartment. The victim was Russell Crowley, and he was killed when Alan Wayne Brubaker hit him on the head with a hammer because of some property dispute. After committing the murder, Alan rode his bike to the same television station that Jennifer Servo would be working at just the next month, and he confessed to the murder. So it does make sense that Jennifer would have been aware of the crime when she moved to Abilene and was living at the same apartment complex the murder had happened in, and maybe this did make her more aware of security and locking doors and such. But I have another option as well. I know police believe that her attacker was someone she knew because there was no forced entry, but how do we know when Jennifer went through her routine of locking her apartment up? Did she lock it as soon as she got inside, or did she go inside and, get ready for bed and then lock her apartment up before she went to bed? So that night she came home, she had some groceries, not much, just a bag or two. She came in, she put the groceries down on the counter, she put her groceries away, she called Dave, had an hour conversation, then she went in, got ready for bed, and then she went to lock up before she went to sleep. Now, I don't know all the evidence that the police have, but it's very possible that someone could have entered her apartment as she was talking on the phone and hid inside until she was off the phone call, attacking her at that point. Jennifer was sort of a public figure. She was on the news. She was attractive and outgoing. Someone could have developed an obsession with her just from watching her on the news and then tracked her down. It doesn't make a lot of sense to me why someone she knew would have stolen her phone, her purse, and a handful of DVDs, that really don't have any value. I mean, I know it was a different time, so maybe these DVDs had some value for like pawning or whatever, but why would someone she knew take those DVDs? None of these items have ever been recovered or found, and they seem to be more of personal value than of monetary value. It is said that Jennifer had a love of Tiffany jewelry, so it makes sense that she would have owned at least a few of these pieces, and Tiffany's jewelry is not cheap, but there's no report that anything else was taken. If someone was there to rob her for things to sell or pawn, wouldn't they take the time to go through the apartment and find items of high value? Now, this could have been just some random drug addict who wanted to grab whatever he could quickly pawn, and he thought he could pawn some of the DVDs and maybe go through her purse later to grab her money. But as far as I know, none of her credit cards were ever used. Her phone was not used again after that, and her empty purse never turned up. In my opinion, and from, the experience I have of looking into these cases, a random criminal isn't really going to hold on to these things. He's going to get rid of them as soon as he figures out that they don't have value. He's going to take whatever cash he can take. He's going to pawn whatever he can pawn, and then just kind of drop the rest in a garbage can or on the side of the road. The fact that they haven't been found means that this person either kept her things as a trophy of some kind or as a connection to her, or that whoever did this to Jennifer was, with it and lucid enough to know that they had to be very strategic and get rid of these things where they could never be found again. Now, I do have a little theory about the DVDs because the kinds of DVDs that were taken are very specific, right? 3 seasons of Sex and the City and then Saving Private Ryan, the movie. Now, remember that Jennifer and Ralph met in the Army Reserves. And I think that he was not a reservist. I believe he was like an actual Army person. Like, I don't know what I'm saying, but a person who was in the Army full-time, enlisted and all that jazz. So the fact that Saving Private Ryan was taken is interesting, as well as a couple seasons of Sex and the City. Jennifer's family and friends made it very clear that she was very career focused. So even though she loved Ralph, a relationship with him or anybody else would have come second to building her career and achieving her dreams that she had. And I know that a lot of men who have these more traditional values of what a marriage should be or what a woman should be, some men who think that a woman belongs, in the home and not in the workplace, they have pointed to shows like Sex and the City as destroying women, as pulling them away from traditional values, as, almost tricking them into thinking that they can have it all. They can go and build their career and have sex with everything that moves and, drink Cosmos in a bar at night and then, have a family when they're done with all of that. And I'm wondering if Ralph maybe was one of those men who thought that Jennifer was too focused on her career, too focused on, building her personal success, and that she was throwing away their relationship because of that. So maybe stealing the Sex and the City DVDs was emblematic. Maybe taking Saving Private Ryan along with those DVDs was also symbolic. I don't know, that's just where my brain went with it, but let me know what you think. Now, 4 months after her murder, Jennifer's parents received a letter from the University of Montana's school library saying that 4 books Jennifer had checked out were overdue. The only strange thing was these books had been checked out after Jennifer's death, which led some people to believe that whoever had killed her and had her purse was toying with the police and Jennifer's family, almost taunting them as if to say, I'm still out, I'm still walking free, I'm messing with you. In the end, it was decided by the police that this was some kind of clerical error, that whoever had been working at the library had accidentally checked the books out under Jennifer's name, which is a big coincidence if you ask me. Of all the people that they could have accidentally checked the books out under, they checked them out under Jennifer Servo's name, who no longer was a student and who had just been brutally murdered. I would personally love to know what books were checked out and kind of look into the titles and what the books are about and see if there's anything that ties back to Jennifer or any of the people that may be suspected of having something to do with her death. I would also like to know if the police went through the library or college surveillance tapes on that day this happened to see who had actually checked them out, because, it's strange, right, that the books were never returned. I've been a college student before, and college students are usually broke. I know I was. So there was no way I was ever going to let my books go overdue or just not return them at all, because I was going to get charged for those books. I was going to get charged overdue fees and eventually just get charged for the whole book, right? And this isn't like your public library where they're just going to send you a letter and tell you like, oh, if you don't return these books, like you're going to get charged for this and we're not going to let you check out books here anymore. At the college library, at least my college, they would charge you that. Like, it would go on your tuition. Like, you would have to pay for that before you could graduate. And I knew I barely had the money to pay for like my tuition, so I'm not going to let my books go overdue. So unless the student who checked them out noticed there had been a mistake and they weren't checked out under their name and they were like, whatever, I'll just, hold on to these. They weren't checked out under my name anyways, like nobody will ever know. I don't see this person just not returning the books at all, unless the person who took them was connected to Jennifer, did have her purse and her library card, and was trying to send a message and wanted those books to go overdue so that her parents would get a letter. But let me know what you think. No one has ever been officially named a suspect in this case. And the last time anyone knew, Ralph Sepulveda was living in Michigan, maybe? No, he was living in Baltimore, Maryland, the next time anybody had tracked him down. Now, I know there are some people who believe Brian Travers could be responsible, the weathermen, but I just don't know. It doesn't seem like there's enough motive. With Ralph, he'd shown that he had a history of lying and being deceitful. He seemed really thirsty to move out of state with a girl he barely knew, move all the way from Montana to Texas, leave everything behind and just, keep going to her apartment after and like crying when she wouldn't take him back. And I don't know if this is the best time for a relationship tip, but I'm sure there's someone out there who needs to hear it. If someone breaks up with you and they don't want to be with you, do not go to their door or stand outside their window with a boombox thinking that it's this big romantic gesture and they're going to take you back. If they've broken up with you, they don't want to be with you, and you should not want to be with them, and they probably don't deserve you. Unless you're in Ralph's situation and you definitely deserved getting broken up with, and then it's even worse. Do not go to your ex-girlfriend's door and beg her to take you back after you've lied to her the entire time you knew her. It's disrespectful to both of you. It's an insult to you both. But anyways, let's move on. I just don't see Brian having enough motive. Like, this girl kissed you, you wanted more, she didn't. She explained to you that, she wanted to focus on her career. She'd had a bad kind of, interaction before you, a bad relationship experience before you. And then you guys are friends and you hang out still. Unless he's like Joe from You and he's just holding all of this psychotic energy inside and stalking her, I just don't see that there's enough motive for Brian Travers. But with Ralph, he moved out of state with a woman he barely knew. He was definitely not happy when this same woman broke up with him after he moved almost 2,000 miles to have a life with her. The kind of crime we're talking about, it would take a lot of rage. And I just don't see where that kind of rage would come from in Brian's case. But I could be wrong. What do you all think? Let me know in the comments section what you think about this case, what you think about, I guess the two main suspects, which would be Brian Travers and Ralph Sepulveda. But like I said, I do also believe that there's a chance it could have just been a random person who was trying to rob her or, just wanted something from her and killed her because she was there. That's possible too. In the description box, you'll also find links to follow if you know anything about the murder of Jennifer Servo. Hopefully this video will reach someone who might know something, and you can call in an anonymous tip if you like. You don't want to be identified, but Jennifer had a very bright future ahead of her. She had a lot going for her, and it was stolen from her. And I want to know why. Her family wants to know why. Their beautiful daughter was stolen from this world before she could reach her potential. And I think that they deserve that closure if they can even ever get it. Thank you guys so much for being here. Don't forget to like this video if you liked it. Share it if you think it's worth sharing. Also, if you have not subscribed already, what are you waiting for? We have a great time here, great people, great community. Come be a part of it. And if you're already subscribed, just make sure you still are, because YouTube likes to unsubscribe people from my channel all the time. And, we're working through it. Also, don't forget to check out the link for Bright Sellers in the description box, and check out the link for my podcast, Crime Weekly, that I co-host with Derek Levasseur. New episodes come out every Friday. Hope to see you there. Thank you so much for being here. Stay kind, stay beautiful, and I'll see you next time. Bye.
Don't break now, and the bottle's going straight down, and that river runs deep, the mountains get steep, and the voices getting too loud. All these feelings I've buried, it's looking like a cemetery. They're coming back from the grave, calling out my name, better say I have Mary. Well, you don't know how deep it goes until it's getting you slowly. So you got to let it go. I got blood.